Olá, pessoal. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Antes de mais nada, eu quero pedir desculpas pelo nosso pequeno atraso. Tivemos problemas. Peço desculpas também pelo barulho. São Paulo, então não posso evitar ou controlar. Peço desculpas pelo excesso de barulho. Nós estamos já com o nosso convidado, Chris Weible. Acho que a gente aprendeu agora a falar o sobrenome. Quando a gente estava no backstage, eu estava conversando rapidinho com ele, e justamente para entender como é que a gente falaria, né? Como é que a gente pronuncia o sobrenome, mas deu tudo certo. Para aqueles que ainda não sabem exatamente o que é que está acontecendo, nós estamos no último seminário, né, na última palestra do nosso primeiro International Seminar on Policy Process. É uma atividade organizada pelo Brazilian Policy Agendas Project, pelo Centro Acadêmico Herbert Souza e pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Gestão de Políticas Públicas da USP, onde eu oriento. E nós já tivemos algumas personalidades, algumas pessoas passando por aqui. No primeiro dia, a gente teve a participação do professor Nicolau Zahariades, falando um pouquinho sobre o modelo dos múltiplos fluxos. Na sequência, tivemos Brian Jones, falando sobre o equilíbrio pontuado. No nosso último encontro, a professora Laura Bonafon veio falar um pouco sobre a estrutura do Comparative Agendas Project, né, do modelo geral do CAP. E agora, para finalizar, eu tenho o prazer de convidar o professor Chris, que vai falar para a gente um pouquinho do ACF, o Advocacy Coalition Framework, que é, junto com os demais, aqueles modelos que a gente mais conhece como sendo também os modelos sintéticos de análise de políticas públicas. Então, sem mais delongas, porque a gente já está um pouquinho corrido no tempo, eu vou trazer o professor Chris para falar com vocês, e na sequência a gente abre para perguntas. Já deixo avisado que todos e todas podem, ao longo da apresentação, utilizar o chat que tem aqui do lado, e aí vocês podem fazer perguntas, podem ir conversando com o nosso convidado. Ao final, eu vou ler essas perguntas. Eu acho que é a forma mais prudente que a gente tem para levar com esse sisteminha aqui do StreamYard. Tudo bem? Então, sejam todos e todas muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas. A gente vai começar agora com o nosso convidado. Okay, Chris. So, one more time, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I'm pretty sure that our students and colleagues and researchers are pretty excited to hear from you. Advocacy Coalition Framework is one of the most frameworks and models used in Brazil. I'm pretty sure that you know that. You know a lot of our researchers that are using this model. So I just want to say thank you again for accepting it just in the first time and for your time. I will do your presentation, so anytime you need to pass to the next slide, just let me know and I will do it. Okay. So thank you so much one more time.
Thank you, Felipe. I appreciate the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here. So just a quick question. Will I be able to see the slides that you're presenting, or will only they see it?
No, you will see as well.
Okay.
Since I am presenting, you can see the presentation, and and they can see the presentation and you.
Okay. Let's get started then. Can we get started then? Is that?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Sure.
Let me open.
I see. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to make this bigger on my screen. Great. Okay, I appreciate it. And thank you again for this invitation. And I do appreciate this opportunity. I have, gosh, I think I have 54 slides, which is way too many for probably this time we have. And so I might skip some, or maybe not. We'll see how things go. I know it's hard in this format to interrupt me. I don't know if there's a chat function. If there's a chat function, perhaps we can, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, and I can answer them as I go. or if something isn't clear, I would also welcome those in the chat also, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. Because I can talk I can talk about the Advocacy Coalition Framework for hours, right? And I don't know if that would benefit you if I just talked and talked and talked. It's probably better if we had some sort of an exchange. So please post your questions if you have them. Please interrupt me if you can, even in this kind of awkward format. And other than that, let's get started. I mean, this isn't a presentation on the Advocacy Coalition Framework. I am planning on giving an overview of the framework with some empirical illustrations from some of my research, and also will summarize research from other scholars that I know out there, and what we've known and what we think we don't know. And it is a very ongoing, rather large research program. I certainly do not know all the researchers that do this work, and it's increasingly impossible for me to keep up with everyone. And I know there's some really incredible scholars in Brazil right now doing work on the Advocacy Coalition Framework that I've had the honor to work with a little bit. So anyway, that said, I'm gonna get started here, and because I could actually, I'm already thinking of the time and how easily this could get out of hand. So Felipe, let's go to the second slide. I'm going to start off with just some of the origins of the framework and how it got started. So I have the next 4 or 5 slides talk about some of the challenges that were perceived, and this is in the U.S. scholarship in the 1980s that formed some of the foundational elements of the framework. And I think many of you know, if you've read the Advocacy Coalition Framework, it was originally designed by Paul Sabatier and Hank Jenkins Smith, and this is what they saw as some of the problems. For example, at the time, the policy cycle was very hegemonic, and its use and understanding of the policy process. And what both Hank and Paul wanted to do was offer something that was a little bit more, I think, dynamic, conflict-based, that kind of broke away from the stages or those steps in the policy cycle. So that's one thing, is just trying to get away from that to show something a little more dynamic. Felipe, let's go to the next one. And second, at the time also, there was tended to be a narrow depiction of actors in the policy process. And in this regard, I mean, partly this was reflection, let's say, of a lot of traditional public administration scholars might focus on a single administrative agency and people therein. Sometimes folks might focus on the iron triangles, and both Hank and Paul were concerned about the neglect of the field neglecting scientists, the news media, courts, a lot of other actors that could be involved. So they just want to open up those actors. And the question, once you opened up the number of actors you look at, the question then becomes, how do you organize them? How do you make sense of them? And that's where the concept of the Advocacy Coalition Framework came in, because in high conflict situations, these actors oftentimes form these coalitions, these tribes, or so forth. Now let's go to the next slide. 3, questions also emerged about the appropriate unit of analysis at the time. Should we be looking at a single government program, a single policy? And some of you might know that Paul Sabatier had already in the 1980s established himself as one of the top scholars in policy implementation, and especially from a top-down perspective, which was a single policy. And during that time period, there was a huge debate between the bottom-up scholars who want to look at implementation from the bottom up, from street-level bureaucrats, and how they worked within multiple policies, or from the top down. And the ACF kind of merges both of those perspectives by looking at essentially a policy subsystem, which is defined by a topical area and usually some sort of geographical scope. It does have fuzzy boundaries. We can talk about that if you want to in the question and answer. Felipe, let's go to the next one, please. Then also at the time also there was a bit of a neglect among policy scholars and political scientists and not looking at enough of what they called at the time the analytical debates and uses of information. I mean, today we'd probably call that narratives and stories. And although they probably thought about the same concepts back then, they kind of phrased it as these kind of analytical debates among these actors involved in these political debates, these conflicts. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, concerned about just time. And I think Paul in particular recognized that sometimes we often neglect the long-term developments of public policy. And so he wanted to analyze, make sure if we understood policy change and learning and so forth, that we would take kind of a long-term perspective. That wasn't necessarily something that we would do all the time. Sometimes some studies may not allow that, but just understanding that temporality of the policy process was important. Okay, let's go to slide 7, please. And so the Advocacy Coalition Framework, I'm going to lay out the design, and I will give empirical examples of many of these components later in the talk. But essentially, as some of you might know, the framework operates from the idea that beliefs are the drivers of human behavior and how we select and interpret and filter the world. And the ACF has this three-tiered belief system: deep core, policy core, and secondary beliefs. I will talk about those here in a moment. Next slide, please. Of course, the beliefs aren't just by themselves kind of help you kind of provide a reason for forming allies and especially against opponents. And we often see that through the coordination, and that's often how we define an advocacy coalition is through those beliefs of coordination. Some studies do not always look at coordination, and that's okay. But definitionally, that's how we define that coalition. We have our own kind of beliefs. This includes identities and views of what policy should be, and we coordinate with our allies. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, there's a rival coalition typically. That's why we form a coalition, is to challenge a set of opponents. Let's go to the next slide. These, give one more, Felipe. I'll go back. Let's go back a couple here. If you can. Maybe they show up slowly on my screen here. Can you back up a couple slides? One more. That's it right there. Again, big part of this framework was about the use of facts and evidence and analysis and argumentation, narratives and stories going back and forth. And they will debate these in the public sphere. Slide 12, Felipe. And of course, we kind of argue that these coalitions engage each other in these policy subsystems, is what we call them. That's, again, they're defined by a policy topic and a territorial domain. It could be at the national level or all the way down to the local level, or it could be at some sort of global, international level. Let's go to slide 13. And of course, we can, or sometimes we kind of organize that slightly a little differently and go to slide 14. These subsystems are set within a kind of a broader setting that involve long-term political opportunity structures, consensus needed for change, openness of the political system. This is where the ACF is very portable, and we like to think that as a framework, it can apply to many political systems. If you go to slide 15, Philippe, in fact, you can go all the way to. In fact, I might just have you go all the way to slide 18, if that's okay, just so we can. A lot of people recognize this is basically the structure of the you can go all the way to 18 if you want. This is the basic structure of the framework. You have these coalitions operating in a subsystem, and usually they're set within the very far left, these kind of stable external parameters. These would be the things like your basic social structure, distribution of resources, the basic constitution of a government, and many other things. And of course, that you know, they're stable, but you know, they can change on occasion. We've all seen our countries. Sometimes our country's basic kind of components of our country change over time. If you go one more slide, Felipe, yeah, there we go. And of course, there's more dynamic external events that change more rapidly. This could be everything from a crisis to an election, to you know, an impact from another subsystem. Could be like the influx of really important information. If you go one more slide forward, and then of course there's feedback loops and everything else. And this is the basic structure of the Advocacy Coalition Framework, where you have a subsystem around a policy topic, and there's these set within usually like a country setting, like these external parameters, and with very more dynamic external events. And you know, the two boxes in the middle, long-term opportunity structures and short-term constraints, those are, I would interpret as more mediating variables between the stable parameters and the external events. They constrain and provide opportunities for those policy subsystems. Can we go one more slide forward, Felipe? There we go. Actually, go back one, I think. I might have been, yeah, there we go. That's what I just showed you is basically what you'll find in almost any textbook on the ACF. Again, you'll have the different boxes and so forth. I presented it in hopefully a more colorful way. Let's go to slide 19, or the next slide. There we go. Now the ACF is, especially for the last 12 years, and I'm very happy to take questions about how this emerged. It is a framework, and we use the word framework akin to what you might hear from people who do work in Ostrom's, Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework. And that is, it's a platform, provides a shared language, it provides basic assumptions, it provides a basic kind of relationship among concepts. It kind of defines almost like an ontology in how what we think is important to look at. And we also like to think that framework is stable over time. We don't change it very much. And it's something that, again, we'd like to think is fairly portable, meaning we think the framework is applicable to many different settings, many different countries. Underneath this framework, we do have different theoretical emphases, one on coalitions, one on learning, and one on policy change. The theories under the ACF may not be applicable across all contexts. And in fact, we would like to imagine them as being somewhat malleable. So for example, in the Brazilian context, the assumptions about coalitions and the theoretical arguments about coalitions in the, let's say, more Western democracies, as you might find in the United States, might be slightly different than what you might find in Brazil. And what we would welcome is scholars to kind of perhaps use the framework, but adapt the theories to the context within which they're working. And this is where we would like ideally the framework would provide the concepts to enable us to communicate and share results, but the theories would allow the flexibility to adapt to different contexts. The theoretical emphases too I mentioned here are coalitions, learning, and policy change. There's potentially more. I often view the framework as almost like the hardware, like on your like an iPhone or even your computer, and where the theories are more akin to, let's say, an app that can be uploaded and used within the hardware. And so the framework of the ACF provides the hardware, provides the basic structure. And a person could upload many different theories underneath this framework. And I can talk about that more if you would like. Moving forward, can we go another slide forward, Felipe? There we go. Before I jump in, I'm going to jump into and discuss each of the theories. But here are kind of, say 5, but actually there's 4. There's a typo. There are many ways to apply the ACF. This is the first point. And as I was saying, it can support many different data sources and various theoretical, I would say, uploads. That gets into the analogy of like an app on your iPhone. The framework is portable. Its theories are designed to be adaptable, and deep understanding of the context should motivate your work. Meaning, like, of course, if you're doing work in any subsystem anywhere, understanding the context of that subsystem is your first task, your first job. No need to apply the whole framework. It's okay to apply just parts of it if that suits your questions and so forth. So, for example, some people just analyze coalitions. Some people might just really focus on policy change and might look at coalitions just a little bit, but it's more or less a study on coalitions. Finally, one of the main points we try to push is be as transparent as possible with all the steps of your research. The reason why we say that is because we are a community that tries to learn from each other and challenge each other and improve upon our scholarship, and on top of that, our knowledge and how we try to contribute and inform the world. And to us, being transparent is the goal. That's how we learn from each other. So I'm going to dive into and explore the different each of the different theories of under the ACF, but I've kind of finished right there on just the framework component. I'm not seeing any comments, but if there are some comments, maybe or maybe not. If there's comments about the framework itself, please put them into the comments. This is a good time to stop if there's questions about the first part of the presentation. Are there any questions at all?
So, Chris, yeah, we have some questions. There's a question about if it is allowed, or if we can or cannot see just institutional and governmental actors in a specific coalition. It is possible to analyze and see a coalition only with actors, institutional and governmental actors, or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's really cool that I like about a lot of the international work on coalitions, and I don't think we're paying enough attention to it, is basically the question of who's in a coalition, like the composition of them, and kind of who's not there. So, for example, in the United States, we're a very pluralistic country. We have a very strong interest group mobilization in this country, and also we have some very strong bureaucratic agencies, and they're often involved in coalitions. Other countries might have very different composition. You might not have allies in government agencies, so a coalition might not have any government officials in them at all. Some countries, I think, have more government officials than they do interest groups, and I think that reflects the constitutional structures of countries, and also reflects how easy or how difficult it is for various perspectives in a country to mobilize. What's also interesting and not being explored enough is who is not represented in coalitions. So who's left out that should be there? And this is a question of representation in democracies, and it's usually an important question that really no one's analyzing, in part because it's difficult to analyze, but something I think we need to start looking at in terms of who has a voice and who doesn't have a voice in these policy disputes. Felipe, did that answer that question?
Yeah, sure. We have a couple more.
Yeah.
And I think it's about the same subject. Maira is telling us that she applied ACF in her dissertation, and she's saying something about, and she wanna hear from you about how you see the role of governments in the Advocacy Coalition Framework. I think when we are trying to look at the subsystem and who is part of not of each subsystem, the role of the state in this kind of analysis.
I think it really depends on the context. And so I know very little about the government and politics, let's say in Brazil. And so um, I would never want to impose an outsider view on what governments do or do not do in that country. I will say, and so the number one point I want to make is let the context um, drive and what you're seeing drive what you report and comment on. I government agencies um, can be members of coalitions. Sometimes they're not. Uh, Sometimes they play kind of a role of a broker in mitigating across coalitions. When I talk to government officials, let's say here in Colorado, they tried to play more of a kind of like a broker role, but often they don't succeed. Oftentimes, they kind of align with one or the other based on their mission as an agency. And that's government agencies, and also depends on the agency. Some of agencies are more, let's say, they provide more information, and so they can often be suppliers of what these coalitions debate about, which often puts them on one side or the other in the coalition. And actually, another kind of interesting role is actually elected officials who, at least the evidence to date, some of them are often, very stable and reliable members of coalitions, but oftentimes elected officials, because they often represent a really diverse community, and often let's say they can influence many subsystems. Sometimes they will trade off one subsystem for another and so they're kind of, I would say, fickle or unreliable members of coalitions. Um, but they can also be really important allies to coalitions. And so I think it really depends on the context and what you're studying. But all that is possible within the ACF. And that's one thing that I think is really exciting, because once we start looking at subsystems across countries, or even within the same country, ideally what I like to see is us pick up patterns and understandings of what policy processes and what policy making looks like and the outcomes based on these different settings. And that'll hopefully allow us to learn about our own setting and compare and contrast against each other.
Nice, thank you. So there's a lot of questions. I will try to make a mix of all this. So the first question is about the difference between a theory and a framework.
Right.
Why Advocacy Coalition Framework is a framework and not a theory? So there's something um, in your slide that show a little bit of it, but still, students still have some questions. Have some questions about why is a framework and not a theory, and how can use different theories to use ACF to explain some coalition, some learning, or policy change.
Yeah. That's a great question. And in the ACF, this became, and there's a story here I'll tell you, but I'll try to keep it short. The ACF made a sharper distinction between its frameworks and its theories in 2011, so relatively recently. It did so, and first of all, let me give you the definitions, and I mentioned this before, but a framework is defined as basically providing the basic assumptions, basic concepts, basic relationships among those concepts. So it does provide that vocabulary and how we think those concepts interrelate. It provides a platform for communication, a platform for us to work together across different contexts and in a way for us to kind of have that dialogue. In a way, it provides a basic ontology of what we think is important in the world and exists that we need to pay attention to. That's the framework. And of course, the theory zooms in a little bit more. It'll focus on, by the way, just backing up a little bit, a framework will also define the basic scope, like what questions a framework is good for answering or investigating. A theory deals with a subset of that scope. It takes those concepts in the theories and it interrelates them in like a hypotheses or propositions or something of a way more concrete relational form that's oftentimes testable or could be explored. And it often involves a specific modeling about how to analyze the data once collected. So for example, I mean, I can, and so let me pause a little bit. One of the reasons why we made this decision in 2011 to kind of make a sharp distinction between a framework and a theory was because the house, if you think of the house of the ACF metaphorically, it was getting really, really messy with a lot of concepts and a lot of interrelationships, and it was changing over time in a way that we had a hard time keeping up with, honestly. And also observers and users of the ACF had a hard time keeping up with all the changes also. And in addition, the framework started to be used, I mean, more and more internationally. And we recognized that the hypotheses and the theories might not apply to every political context in the world. And yet we needed a framework that was portable, but we also needed to recognize the importance of context. And so the theories provided a means for us to ensure that the framework could be applied, let's say in Brazil, and incorporate the Brazilian context and adapt the theories to Brazil. And actually leaders in Brazil, let's say the leaders and the public policy leaders can develop their own theoretical emphases under the ACF. And it could be a Brazilian theory of coalitions. And we would welcome that, actually. In fact, that would be great. That's what we want. Or let's say maybe the coalitions in Brazil operate exactly like they do in the United States. Maybe they look exactly the same. I kind of doubt that, but maybe that's the case. And then that would be fine too. But that's kind of the motivation there. And again, I love these questions, by the way, but I could talk more about what, the theoretical emphases of coalitions and so forth with the PowerPoint presentation too, if you want.
Yeah, sure. I will save some questions for later, since I already looked your presentation, so I know that a lot of questions you may reply or talk about it during your presentation. I think the last question in this first part, it's about the political regime. Like, this is good. I never thought about that before. So ACF can be applied in democracy, autocracy, dictatorships. This is new for me too. So I want to also hear something from you about it.
Yeah, do you want me to, can I respond to that? Yeah, so the ACF, well, first of all, it's complicated. Yes, you can apply the ACF in any political system, but that does not mean that you should apply it in every system. And this is something that's currently being explored around the world. So I work with scholars in China, and we did a meta review and found that in China, I think there was about 81 applications, and my Chinese colleague reviewed them and analyzed them. And of course, we found coalitions. We found a lot of the applications in China generalize pretty well to what we might see in the United States or Western Europe, let's say. The difference might be in China, there's fewer interest groups. Government agencies have way more power, or they're at least more centralized in the networks. International NGOs actually have a bigger role to play. A few fundamental patterns that, and there's a few more than that. But what's interesting too is, the question is, the ACF, like any theory, has a set of language, right, that's embedded in it. And this language drives what we see. And just because we can see it doesn't mean it's, appropriate or the best interpretation of that setting. And so, yes, you can apply the ACF to China. Does it do the best job of, I say best job, that's not really the best, all that technical, right? But does it do a good job and the best job of understanding the policy processes there? And I think that's still an open, and it's an open discussion that we should be having. And same with Brazil, I would say. What's also interesting about, let's say, an authoritarian regime like China is that you do see in China, like in the United States, metaphorically, let's say, like this is the freedom you might have for a coalition to like behave. They have all this room to maneuver. They can do all these changes. They can do all kinds of stuff. In China, you do get coalitions, but this is what they can do. They're more bound by certain rules of the game there, let's say. And so there are coalitions there, but they're just restricting them in the movement. And actually, when I talk to political actors in China, they're very aware of what they can do and can't do, and what it means to break those rules. And they understand the political strategies that are possible there. And so what we need to do is start understanding, let's say, what it means to work within the constraints of a political system. And when I talk to some scholars who are applying the ACF in Iran, the same patterns, the same kind of discussions emerge. I say all this, but I am very much a skeptic in terms of applying theories blindly around the world. So I like it because I can have these discussions and we're debating. But if someone were to say, gosh, the ACF is a complete failure in China, I think I would accept that if but right now we're just playing with it. And so hopefully something like that, hopefully we'll either learn and adapt it or just realize that it just doesn't work. We shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, perfect. Sergio, who made this question, I think you have a lot to think about after this answer. So, Chris, let's go back to the presentation because there's a lot of questions about how to apply and how to use the framework. And I know this is something that you will talk about in this second part. So I will save some questions and then we can go back if the students still have questions about it, okay?
Okay, sounds great. Okay. Let's go back. I think we're on slide 22.
Okay.
And so we're going to talk about each of the theoretical emphases, and maybe I'll take a breakout for each one. I'm going to start with coalitions. I'm going to go to learning, and I'm going to go to policy change afterwards.
Okay. Let me go.
Yeah, sure.
By
the way, for everyone, this one? Yes, you can go one slide forward. For everyone who's watching this, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to take questions privately. And also the ACF community is big and there's so many people here, including a lot of great Brazilian scholars. And so, yeah, we can help you with your questions one-on-one if you want. But Felipe, let's go to the next slide, slide 23. So you can just, I think there's some, yeah, there you go. So again, we're talking about advocacy coalitions, policy actors who basically share beliefs and coordinate their behavior, and use resources and try to achieve their goals over time. What's kind of interesting about the ACF too, in a way it's kind of boring, because basically if you think about it, any time in human history when there's been, let's say, a conflict or we feel a threat, we've always joined into like tribes or teams or political parties or something to protect our interests. That's all the ACF is kind of really saying here. And this is why it's kind of portable, but it's kind of, the question is kind of boring. In almost any political system where there's a minimal amount of opportunities for groups to form these alliances, you're likely to find them, I think. But the question we should be asking is, what do they look like? What strategies are they using? Who's not represented? Who are they representing? And how much influence they have, let's say. these are some of the questions we should be asking, whether or not they exist or not, which I think we focus so much on, are these coalitions, do they exist? Well, we see them everywhere. And it's not, actually, I don't think it's that interesting that we do find them, because it's like, yeah, we form alliances. But let's take another slide forward to the next slide. And this slide, man, I'm just going to let you read this on your own. But the ACF, when you think of the ACF coalitions, theory of coalitions, you can think of the theory almost as an archetypical story, a depiction of what a coalition, what the ACF would argue. And what this slide basically shows here is basically the hypotheses in the ACF, all kind of bundled into a story. Like if we were to create like a trailer for a movie, right? It would, it'd be like, hey, in open democratic systems, when policy actors feel that threat, and to their policy values, more likely to form these coalitions. And you can just read it from there on, and they try to adapt these strategies, try to win over time, and so forth. Note that the assumption in open democratic systems is the assumption, and that's the archetypical story. What we're playing with, well, first, what is an open democratic system? I don't know if we're really that open in the United States anymore. I think we try to be. I know Brazil's had some issues too, and so we might even want to think about that, right? But this is the archetypical story, right? What would be interesting is when what happens if we change those baseline assumptions? What about in a less effective democratic system? What might it look like? This is where we get into how theories are adaptable under the ACF. But this is the archetypical story. This is the main story. And if you go one slide forward to the next slide, these are the basic 5 hypotheses. You'll see this in almost any, back up one, Felipe. There you go. These are the 5 hypotheses in the ACF that I just kind of paraphrased into a story, because hypotheses, man, they're just kind of boring to read. But the story, at least I find, I like to think of the story of the ACF for coalitions in the previous slide. But these are the hypotheses. Some of these are tested a lot, and some aren't. What the ACF does not do well at, and I would say every theory, for the most part, does not do well at this. We have a lot of evidence for some of these hypotheses. We have, and it's very confirming. For example, hypothesis 1 has been mostly confirmed everywhere. We have mixed evidence for some of these, and some of these we have really no evidence at all. And this is where I think for these theories, we need to be very clear about where our knowledge comes from, what we think are guesses, what is mixed in terms of unclear evidence, and how this is really dependent upon context. Like, so for example, ideally, we would get the whole group of ACF studies in Brazil, do a review and say, hey, what do coalitions look like in Brazil? How do they play out? And that's something that I think was really, really needed. If we go one more slide forward, Felipe, we have, gosh, these are just some definitional things. I don't know if I should spend a lot of time on this, but we have this 3-tiered belief system. It is a kind of like a theory, a model of what we kind of imagine is going on inside our heads, but it's also just a way of organizing our data. We have deep core beliefs, which are your political ideologies, your identities, your cultural orientations, and so forth. Policy beliefs are those general kind of normative and empirical beliefs about a policy issue, about general views of a problem to general policy goals. And secondary beliefs are more your means for achieving those goals. And of course, the ACF, and a lot of people would argue this, would argue that you're more likely to adapt your means before you give up on those goals. And there's some evidence to that. I will say, though, that the operationalization, how we actually measure these policy core beliefs and secondary beliefs, man, there's a lot of debate about how to do this. I don't know if debate's the right word. We struggle on how to do this. We don't have it nailed down. But in general, there's some fundamental truths about this 3-tiered belief system. And I can talk about that in the Q&A too. Can we go to the next slide too? As I started this paper, there's loads of different ways of analyzing and applying and analyzing coalitions. Some people do online or paper surveys. There's not one survey instrument, but there's many out there. And I'm happy to share with you what we've used in the research group that I work with. Some people will hand code testimonies and hearings. A lot going on in the news media these days with discourse network analysis. Some people, Elgin is one of my students, he looked at hyperlink analyses between websites. Some people based it on interviews, in fact, many, and also some informal / observational, I don't know what analyses was supposed to mean. But the point is that people analyze and look at these coalitions in so many different ways. And this is also kind of interesting. I have to think of these coalitions as these abstract kind of phenomenon that I think exist, but they're really complex. And they're so complex that you just can't look at them. If you look at them through a survey, you get one kind of image of them, one face of them. Interviews will give a different face of them. And oftentimes interviews, of course, you get the in-depth, thick descriptions. A survey might get a more broader kind of quantitative description. Discourse network analysis of the news media, a lot of limitations there too, but that might give you a longitudinal analysis. People are more and more using social media to analyze them. Benefits to that. And each of these approaches, I'm not sure you can say that one is better than the other in terms of depicting a coalition. Each one presents a different slice of it, a different part of it. And that's what's kind of cool about the ACF is that we have all these ways you can analyze coalitions, but it's also the challenge in terms of how we try to generate knowledge about them. And that's one of the things we can talk about too. Like, how do we actually build knowledge about coalitions going forward? If you go to the next slide, Felipe, I think it's this is just, boy, I don't. This is a paper that hopefully will be accepted soon for a journal. I'm going to show a lot of paper, some data, some practice data, not practice data, some data from our lab on oil and gas development. Fracking is another way of saying it in Colorado. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the methods, but basically we have a 2013, 2015, 2017. There's an online survey to policy actors. These are people actively involved. And this survey, basically, we have some people in a panel and some people aren't in a panel. And so like on here, like the left side, you see the non-panel people. On the right side, you see the panel people. And so basically, we used a k-mean cluster analysis to cluster these, and we use an optimization to figure out the number of coalitions. But we have 2 coalitions, and the anti-oil and gas coalitions, kind of like the pro-environmentalists, all these people who hate hydraulic fracturing and fracking and oil and gas development. That's on the top, and those means are all kind of somehow against oil and gas development. And you see the high 4s and stuff. And of course, on the bottom is the pro-oil and gas. They're all basically those low numbers basically mean that they're in favor of it. And what this shows, the significant differences is not a lot of difference within the coalitions. They're very much cohesive internally, and very much there's a strong difference between them. And there's some change over time as those significant differences show, but for the most part, they're kind of stable. That's just example data. All these we classified as policy core beliefs. They're basic problems, basic positions. That's how we identify these coalitions in this case. But if you go to the next slide, Felipe, we have, this is a book we wrote on the same oil and gas development, but we looked at a 7-country comparison. And this is where I really learned a lot, because I worked with some of the top scholars in each of these countries. And, we did interviews and surveys in the United States. In Canada, they did media analysis and a survey. Switzerland, they did documents and a survey. Same with the United Kingdom. Germany, they did a media analysis. Sweden, they just did documents and web analysis. And France, they did interviews and documents. We have qualitative, quantitative. And gosh, the book highlights the different ways you can analyze coalitions, but it really dawned on me that not one way was better than the other, that each of these ways provides a different insight into what coalitions might look like. And for a student or someone in Brazil want to analyze coalitions, what this should open you up to is there's more than one way to do this. And what you want to do is leverage your particular way. So if you're doing interviews, get that thick description of the coalitions. If you're doing news media, do it over time and leverage the fact that news media is longitudinal and so forth. So you just try to leverage the data sources you have to pull out as much insights as you can about the coalitions. Ideally, you'd use multiple sources, but oftentimes that's not possible, and that's okay. Let's go to the next slide. Lessons about coalitions. Well, first of all, their existence are largely beyond doubt. There's so much evidence out there that they exist. But there's a big but there, right? Some of the traditional hypotheses have been confirmed, most of that archetypical story, but there's, of course, exceptions and nuances. We do find the belief homophily that people tend to coordinate with people that are like-minded. Overwhelming evidence on that, especially in high conflicts. The lower the conflict, it becomes less important. It's difficult to verify that the assumption that ACF, that coalitions can exist almost in any political system, because there is like this kind of contextual need, and of course we haven't studied all of them, but there's a lot of evidence that we do find them. And of course, there's many ways you can measure them, and so I think within the ACF world, I think what we're lacking is this kind of contextual comparison across, let's say, like again, between Brazil, China, United States, Germany, or whatnot, what they look like. And this is where I think we need more comparative analyses and probably groups of scholars. This is something I've been wanting to do, but I've been too busy. Groups of scholars, let's say I work with Felipe, some of you, some scholars in China, Germany, and so forth. Imagine all of us agreed upon the same interview instrument, the same interview questions. We picked similar systems to look at, and we analyze and compare those, what we find based on that similar instrument. That's what we need actually to improve this, improve a lot of the knowledge that we're gaining from the ACF. But anyway, that's kind of my brief summary about coalitions. I was going to talk about learning and policy change next. Should we stop for questions again, Felipe? Or should we keep going? What do you think?
Let me stop to sharing the screen. There's some questions over here.
Yep.
And I also have a specific questions. I don't know exactly if this is the right time to do it, but my question is about the policy area.
Mm-hmm.
If you can say something about why we see a lot of studies about environment, water, and natural resources, and so on. And here in Brazil, for example, most part of the social studies are about health and education, mm-hmm. and social policies. For example, we have like a strong history about these subjects in social studies. However, different from other models or theories like punctuated equilibrium theory or multiple streams, we see this kind of difference when we are here in Brazil looking for explanation how policy change in education or health or LGBT policies. We used to use models and theories like Kingdoms or Baumgartner and Jones. Mm-hmm. However, most part of the studies looking for policy change or coalitions or whatever we want to see in this kind of specific subject or policy areas like water, environment, and we see studies applying ACF. Mm-hmm. International journals and applications, we see the same thing. A lot of studies based in analyzing this kind of policies. Do you know why we see that?
Of course, why is always hard, right? This is my explanation of that. Paul Sabatier studied environmental issues. Hank Jenkins Smith studied environmental issues. And of course, their students predominantly studied environmental issues. So I'm a Paul Sabatier student. Most of my issues I study are environmental. I go to conferences and I often hang out with like Karen Ingold, who studies environmental issues in Switzerland. And she starts doing ACF work, right? Daniel Norstedt, he does more natural disasters, but oftentimes related to environmental issues like nuclear power or forest fires. And so I think partly and of course I have students. I have like a lot of students out there, and they pretty much study environmental issues. And so I think if you look at the ACF distribution of cases, if there's 100, let's say you look at a random sample of 100 cases, I think you'll see about 30 to 40 involving the environment. Not most of them, but there's still 60, 2/3 of them are not. And so there is a good number of cases that are not involving the environment. And we should be doing that. I think it's really applicable. But this is really cool, Felipe, because it's actually, I'm working with one of my students right now is exploring the ACF with abortion in the United States. As you know, that's an important issue in the United States. We've had some recent policies restricting abortion in Texas, as an example. And abortion, what's interesting is that you have these deep core beliefs, these fundamental beliefs about our identities and normative views, and abortion kind of fits up there. And it's also a policy issue. So you have these deep core beliefs and your policy core beliefs really overlapping, more so than you might find in other cases. And that shouldn't stop you from analyzing the coalitions we see in the United States on abortion. But it adds this kind of this issue with how we think about our deep core and policy core beliefs. And I would think, for example, like in environmental issues, where let's say, there's, I know it's kind of a model, it's not exactly, but let's say there's a bigger separation between your deep core and your views on the environment. Whether or not that's true or not, we could talk about it. Maybe it's not true. But abortion, let's say it's really, really close. I would think that for abortion, those coalitions would be, because it's so geared towards your fundamental beliefs, would be way more stable, way more kind of like emotional than, let's say, something on the environment, where it's like a little bit more detached from your identity and your religious beliefs and everything else. And that's this hypothesis, but I'm guessing if you look at those abortion coalitions, they'll be way more stable over time than, let's say, on oil and gas. But that's something that needs to be explored for sure. And I just blame myself for your answer. I study the environment. I would say 90% of my students do. We just need to get away from that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought, because sometimes we just don't know how to explain or how to see easily the difference between 2, 3, or 4 different groups. When we analyze very moral and religious-based policy, it is a little bit clear or more clear to identify some coalitions and different groups. So I was just wondering if in social policies like health, education, or different areas, it is easier or the opposite to understand and to apply ACF. So when I was thinking about some hypotheses why we are using a lot of ACF in policies like energy, water, maybe that's the reason. So okay, no more questions from me. Let's see the students. They have different questions. Okay, there's a specific question really interesting here. I will try to mix some questions because they are making some repetitions. That it's about the methods. This is, of course, one big question. Because ACF, there's a very clear proposition with a lot of hypotheses. It's a very strong framework. However, the way to get there, the way to use the methods are pretty different from different researchers and different research questions, for example. So I think that one thing that can answer different questions from our students is, if you have any suggestion, if you have something more to say, seeing a lot of people applying, yourself applying ACF, so how to do it? We know we saw there's a different methods, but the question is, I don't know if it is a question, but this is something they want to know about. Okay, they understand the model, they understand the framework, they understand the hypothesis, but how to make and to put actors and institutions in different coalitions, how to operationalize it. I don't know how the word in English. Yeah, how to do it.
I understand. I don't have a good answer to this question, but I will say, I think it depends on the type of questions you're exploring, the amount of time you have, maybe the amount of money you have, and how much resources you have. It's going to drive a lot of your methods. So, for example, we now have. This is not a good example for Brazil. You can correct me, I think, on this. But for example, we have a pretty well-established procedure for coding news media using discourse network analysis and analyzing coalitions under that. And this has been based on Philip Liefeld's work. And sometimes when you get down to the modeling, like what statistical approach should you use to kind of pull apart those coalitions, like what to use, like exponential random graph models or k-mean cluster analysis, whatever. A lot of play there, but actually collecting the data is pretty well done. But of course, like, at least I've been told, like in Brazil, like sometimes the newspapers might not be the best, maybe I'm wrong, may not be the best approach for identifying coalitions. Is that kind of true, Felipe?
No, we can apply it to Brazil as well. There's a lot of people doing it.
Okay, I mean that's one way, but when you get down to the modeling, the statistical modeling, that's much harder, and so that's where, what I would do. So if I was a student in Brazil interested in analyzing news media using the ACF, one is I'd reach out to the scholars who've done it, like me, Karen Ingold, Philip Liefeld, and so forth. Ask about our code approach. What we typically do is that usually I might have my PhD students are way better at this than I am. I'd have you talk to them because they do most of the work, and they would kind of like show you and like usually walk you through what we've done. And then when it gets down to the data analysis itself, that's still an open game because we're not quite sure the best way to model a coalition. If you're doing interviews, for example, that's really hard too, because there, I mean, the typical technique is, you can ask really, who you talk to, who you're collaborating with, what your beliefs are in certain things. And the ACF, I mean, there's so many ways you can analyze interviews. I don't even know if I should even talk about it, but when I do interviews, I understand the context. So I'll do a round of preliminary interviews and just talk to people. First of all, like try to understand the system as best I can through the news media, through social media. And then I'll talk to people and just understand, okay, what's going on? What are the boundaries of the subsystem? Who's involved, who's not involved? What are the major government agencies? What are the major venues that decisions are being made? So I'll kind of map out the system. And then once I understand kind of the context, I'll go through and do another round of interviews and understand, ask more pointed kind of deductive questions about what I like to test and explore. And oftentimes I'll, like with the fracking work we've done in oil and gas, we actually even share the interview questions with a few kind of the super elites or like the really important leaders to make sure we're asking questions they want us to ask. Because we do try to get back to the communities. So we'll ask questions, we'll map out the conflict, and then we'll get back to the communities when we're all done. And that way, it feels like we're doing something like a service to the community, but also make sure our questions are relevant and important to them and to us. And so we'll kind of grade it from the ground up, but we do repeat that every time. So even if I have questions I used to do work on marine issues, those interview questions, they might be somewhat applicable to fracking in Colorado, but they might not be, and the people there might not care about them as much. And so it is kind of, you do kind of adapt. And finally, I will say, in 1993, there's a wonderful appendix in the book by Jacob Smith and Sabatier on coding legislative hearings. That's still relevant today for understanding beliefs, like coding policy core secondary beliefs and hearings and so forth. And so it's still a good source, actually, even today. And survey-wise, there's a lot of surveys floating around, and we're actually creating right now an ACF website where we'll post those surveys. But again, gosh, the context is so important. So whereas punctual equilibrium can look at like very general like frames, let's say in the media, or let's say legislative hearings, ACF is way more specific than that. And so, like if we had a survey that worked in Colorado on fracking, you can look at it and adapt those questions to some issue in Brazil. But I'd be really wary of that, actually. I mean, I think the concepts of policy core beliefs, we need to agree on the concepts, but how you operationalize them needs to be very tailored. So I don't know, Felipe. I don't know if I'm answering this question other than it's complicated.
Yeah, Chris, you did a great job. Like, there's no specific question for it. Like, the students must look what the researchers around the world are producing, how they are doing it, and try to adapt. There's not a receipt. There's not something that we can apply everywhere to solve any kind of problem. Like, the students must look the production, what the researchers and colleagues are doing, and try to adapt and try to produce and understanding the model, understanding the framework, they can do it. They can make their own categories and make and put the actors and the institution in different coalitions. Just justify it. Just try to show us how you did that and why you were using this specific framework. There's not more than we can do.
I'd also say, like, I've done a survey before. This is my dissertation. I came up with some good original questions, but there's some limitations to it. And then, of course, I think there was about 4 or 5 surveys after mine that replicated what I did. And I'm like, those are terrible questions. I got it published. They're good at the time, but I will never use them again. And so sometimes when you publish these surveys without commentary, without the limitations, it can put us into a spiral in terms of not good data. Because, gosh, we've all done surveys, and gosh, some questions you can pre-test everything else, but some questions just fail. So I don't know.
So one method specific question that it took a lot of time to appear here. I was expecting it before about the time framing, about the 10 years. So is it negotiable? Like, can we please see this is something that you maybe hear from different researchers a lot. So about this framing.
Yeah, don't get too seriously. Here's the big point. So, for example, I've done surveys of what I might try to spend time analyzing the structure of a coalition, who's talking to who, and how they coordinate, let's say. And I might do a survey, a 2017 survey. But really, my goals are to understand what that coalition looks like in 2017. I'm not that interested in terms of understanding long-term patterns of policy change, long-term patterns of learning, long-term patterns of coalitional structure, and how coalitions change, with defecting members and not over time. It's just 1 year, and that's okay. But if the goals are to understand, let's say, long-term patterns of policy change, maybe you should take that long-term perspective. It depends on your research question. If I were to interpret that question, my 2017 data, let's say, sometimes it's good to interpret that in terms of the long, like informally, right? Like, okay, so how does this fit into the long-term patterns of oil and gas in Colorado? But really, I wouldn't put too much weight on that. What's really important to realize with the ACF, the original version of the ACF, the title was Policy Evolution, I think, had that in it, was not policy change. And it emerged because of Paul Sabatier's interpretation from an implementation and how policies are implemented, but they go through this constant ongoing tinkering or adjustments over time, right? And so he thought of it as evolution. Aaron Wildowski also looked at implementation almost from an evolutionary perspective, because these ideas, these rules are constantly adopted and change. Actually, this is an interesting story. There was a handwritten note from Eleanor Ostrom to Paul to change the word policy evolution to policy change, because she thought the word evolution had too much baggage with it. I think that was actually a mistake, actually, looking back on it, because the word evolution gives a different impression of what we're talking about. We're talking about this constant evolution of a policy subsystem. When we think of policy change, we think of change, and then it's done. And that's not the purpose of it, actually. Sometimes we want to understand one instance of policy change, but it is this evolution. We've kind of lost that evolutionary perspective, and I think that's kind of sad.
Okay, perfect. Chris, we have 30 more minutes.
Yeah.
So there's the time we have this room available. It's online, but still time for this room. So should we go back to your presentation and go ahead and you just let me know if you want to skip something?
How about I go through it as fast as I can and see if we can wrap it up in about 10 minutes and get more questions.
I will go back there.
Yeah, go back to the learning slides. I think slide 32 if you can.
Yeah.
And for any student who's listening, reach out to me and happy to help out if you have any questions. Let's go one slide ahead. Basic, let's see here. Yeah, basic, yeah, I know you have to go, your slide 32, just, One more. There you go. Again, some basic definitions. Learning is basically enduring alterations of thought or behavioral intentions. 4 categories that we think are important for affecting learning. One is the nature of the venue, the forum or the collaboration. Sometimes if you're in a situation where there's good rules of negotiation and discussion, more likely to learn where the conflict is mitigated. Level of conflict between coalitions matters. Higher the conflict, more reinforcement. Attributes of the stimuli, the type and source of information, and also even the people themselves. Sometimes it depends on, we have data to show that it depends on how extreme your beliefs are, you learn less, maybe, or like more likely to change your beliefs, who you interact with, your networks. You can go one more slide forward. This is the typical, this is like, we think of like the archetypical story of coalitions. Here's the archetypical story of learning, basically that actors seek information because they're really driven by their beliefs and they tend to filter through their belief systems. Most learning is, I'll say, more reinforcement of beliefs than not. But when learning does, if it does occur, it typically occurs at with intermediate levels, with moderate levels of conflict, not intense conflict. Yeah, I think that's kind of the archetypical story. You guys can read it. I guess just fine. But let's go to one more slide forward. These are the basic hypotheses. You'll find this in any book. Again, I took these hypotheses and I packaged them into that archetypical story on the previous slide. Let's go another slide forward. One point with the ACF that's really, I think it's a point of, I don't know, ambiguity is the right word, but let's say a point we're not necessarily clear about, and that is the relationship between belief change and learning. And so we have a paper coming out. This is the same oil and gas data that I showed you before. And we have panel, non-panel data, and we're reporting belief change and learning, basically. And it is kind of an interesting question. If you change your beliefs, is that evidence of learning? We can talk about it, right? But it is kind of like an interesting point. But here, basically, this is some of our panel data between different years. And these are the same kind of beliefs I kind of showed you before about oil and gas development. And basically, what this shows is the amount of change between any 2 years, or actually even across 3 years in the panel, basically. Basically what it shows here is that these are they're not even learning, these are just reported beliefs. Most people over time do not report change in their beliefs at all. I mean, they just report the same beliefs every year. And that's what, the different colors, the different beliefs, but a vast majority of them are right around 0. It does not say that belief change doesn't happen. Sometimes you do see change. Most change is 1 point on this 5-point scale, from 1 to -1, and occasionally 2. And if you look over there, you might see a -4 or something. But for the most part, people are kind of stable. They don't change. Most people kind of don't change their beliefs. And again, we don't even tell them what they thought before, right? They filled out a survey in 2013. 2 years later, they filled it out again. Most people report the same thing. Let's go to the next slide, if that's okay. So that wasn't reported, asking them to report, did they change their beliefs? Here we're asking them, okay, let's talk some self-reported learning. So in 2017, for example, we asked, since I became involved, have I become more convinced of the benefits? My views haven't changed, or become less convinced of the benefits? And then below, same thing with the risks. And don't worry about the frequency of responses over there. Go to the next slide, because we kind of combined all of this into one more slide. Can you get one slide forward? This is the slide I want you to pay attention to. So basically, we combined. Okay, this is going to be okay. So basically, if they reported no change in risks or benefit, that's like reinforcement. If they say they're even more convinced of the risks, let's say if you're pro oil and gas, if you become more concerned, more convinced about the benefits, that's reinforcement. If you become more concerned about the risks, that's the change. And of course, no change is no change. And of course, if you're against oil and gas, reinforcement would be even more concerned about the risks and less convinced about the benefits. Regardless, over time, these 2 time periods, this is self-reported. Most people said, hey, I reinforced my beliefs. Very few people said they changed their beliefs. we're seeing this across everywhere. It makes sense. People do not change their beliefs very often, but it does occasionally happen. Let's go to the next slide. These are kind of hard to kind of explain, so I'll do my best. Here we gave them basically information favorable to, like we gave them like these scenarios, right? Think of a little game. We give them scenarios about information about expanding oil and gas. So let's say we said, hey, imagine science showed that oil and gas development was completely safe for the environment. No harm. Would you be open to expanding oil and gas if information said it was good for the environment or good for public health? And of course, what's interesting here is that if you're pro oil and gas, you're more likely to, this will reinforce your position. And some people, even with better information, they don't want to expand it. They almost think it's enough. I always think this is wine. I like wine. So if I drink 2 glasses of wine a night, and if some Surgeon General in the United States were to say, hey, you could drink 5 glasses of wine in a night and you're still healthy, I don't think I would drink more wine. I think I'd still stick with my 2 glasses because that's enough for me. But this is like the oil and gas. If it says, hey, oil and gas is safe for the environment, do you want to drill more? They're like, no, we're fine. And of course, with the environmentalists, the anti-oil and gas, you do see some change. There's a good 40% said, hey, we're willing to change this if the information said it was completely safe. Information favorable to limiting oil and gas, if you're on the anti-environmental side, all of them basically said, yes, we should limit this, reinforce their position. And mostly the pro oil and gas basically rejected it. So all I'm saying here, the basic pattern is essentially you're seeing a lot of reinforcement, with the exception of the anti-environmentalists, or excuse me, anti-oil and gas, are somewhat open to change if that information were available. But boy, that was a mouthful. Let's go on to the next slide. Learning insights. One is, if you just because I'm stumbling about, if you have learning is really hard to measure. You have self-reported beliefs like the benefits and costs. If people say, hey, did my beliefs change or not? What would you say? It's really hard to get this. And it's also really hard to get panel data. So it's really hard to study any of this stuff. And also even how to measure it. Like we have questions about, prompting them with different information sources. Would they change their beliefs? That's hypothetical. We have questions about self-reported. We have panel data, all really hard. But we do find beliefs tend to stay stable over time. Reinforcement is the predominant pattern. And oh yeah, and then, yeah, I think you're one slide ahead, but that's okay. Literally big questions. Here's some big questions. One is, what facilitates the role of brokers, role of certainty and uncertainty in learning. All these are kind of the questions that we should be asking, but really it's just hard to measure this stuff. Let's go to the next slide. This should not take too much time, but this is on, go one more slide forward here. I'm looking at the time. We don't have too much time. Let's go. Yeah, there's the archetypical story. We love that. Basically in ACF, there's kind of 4 explanations: shocks or events, hurting stalemate, where they just get tired of fighting, decide to negotiate, and learning, where it actually can kind of lead to change, maybe incrementally. But that's kind of like that. Let's go 2 slides forward. Yeah, right there. You can even get the little dialogue on the right. These are the 55 public policies that were adopted in Colorado on oil and gas. And don't ignore those little lines because this is from another publication. The question is, what explains these 55 public policies? And if you get the little box on the right, click one more slide forward, there's an animation, I think. Yeah. What's interesting, there's no dominant explanation of policy change for any of these. Among the 55 instances, we see examples of internal shocks with an explosion, external shocks with elections, learning with health risks. And it's almost each of these instances have their own idiosyncratic little story of change and explanation. We're still playing with this data. I don't quite know what to do with it, but we are, I think, when we have confirmation of ACF, we see all those instances, we have the pathways of ACF could be confirmed in all these instances, but it's kind of not very satisfactory because I guess they're so general that of course you'd find them. It's kind of like multiple streams. Each one of these instances of policy change, you probably could find a window of opportunity, right? You probably find the 3 streams merging. They're easy to find. And so it's hard to disconfirm. I think same with the ACF in this regard. And that's something we need to work on. Let's go one more slide forward. Yeah, so many cases confirm that's the policy change. But again, I think that's, I kind of say, oh, so what? Big deal. We need to kind of dig deeper. link it to coalitional structure, which not a lot of people do. So we have coalitions studied here, we have policy change over here, but oftentimes they're not studied that closely. And most of this work is qualitative process tracing. If you go to the next slide for the big questions, what does policy change mean? Need to focus on, policy change by venue more, connected to coalitional structure, like I said, major, minor change, that has other needs and so forth. Let me stop there because I think we may only have 10 minutes, and I just have some basic slides at the end. But maybe there's more questions because I went through this kind of fast, and I worry about going too fast. And I'd rather get questions than just talk fast for another 5 minutes.
Okay, Chris, I'm sorry about the time.
Oh no, this has been fun.
Yeah, and you said two specific words that make some students really happy. It's about the policy broker and the multiple stream framework. The question is there any difference, or how close the policy broker are from the policy entrepreneur? What's the difference between these two terms? How can we think about policy entrepreneur and policy broker in the policy change process?
Yeah. Okay. First off, these concepts are in our heads, right? They're in our own little ontologies that we think exist in the world, right? So we come up with these definitions, these words in our head, and we give descriptions to these words, and then we're going to the real world trying to find examples of them, right? And so of course in our imaginary world, everything can be very crisp and cleanly distinguished, right? And I think and so a broker is in the ACF world is someone that helps coalitions reach agreement, right? It could be a member of a coalition, it could be a government official, it could be a scientist, although I don't think we're good at doing that sort of thing. It could be anybody, right? But again, the goal is to help coalitions reach agreement. And there's a lot of examples of finding coalitions or brokers who help kind of moderate the peace. And we have those in our families, right? We have those everywhere. A policy entrepreneur, I do think conceptually is very different as someone who's championing a policy idea, right? And they're the ones that are kind of out there. They're trying to advocate for a particular solution, and oftentimes they merge those streams. And we also see entrepreneurs in the ACF, and typically they're the champions within a coalition. They could be a policy broker, but I would say typically they're not, at least the situations that I'm imagining, in part because they're so bent on advocating for a particular solution that oftentimes they're viewed as the enemy by the rival coalition. And so this does not mean that an entrepreneur cannot, they might be a broker, but an entrepreneur could, basically they could just kind of dominate the other coalition and be viewed as kind of like the devil by them, whereas a broker shouldn't be. And so I do think there's a distinction between the terms. And I think empirically you'll find examples of them very different. And also it's probably examples where they're kind of the same.
Chris, do you think that the time that policy broker and the policy entrepreneur act, it is also different? Like policy entrepreneur maybe is something more related to the agenda setting or more related to the pre-decisional moments, and the policy broker is not someone who acts specific in the pre-decisional moment and during the process, during something, or this is not exactly a difference?
It's interesting. I think that's a good empirical question. And someone should look at that. Yeah, I can see that. But also, first of all, in a way, I'm going to repeat what you said. I think that's kind of an interesting idea. So if you look at, let's say, a decision-making venue, let's say there's a task force that some president or some governor or some official said, hey, I'm going to put everybody together in this little task force, this one venue, and solve your problems. A broker might emerge in that scenario to help them resolve their differences, let's say. But that's at the decision-making venue. And I can totally see a policy entrepreneur trying to get something on the agenda because they have to champion that idea and kind of pull together their coalition. I can see that happening too. And I do think a policy entrepreneur and promoting their idea could bring on kind of try to attract members of the opposing coalition. But man, in high conflict situations, it's not very often I see like an entrepreneur who can go across coalitions. If you're mobilizing one side, oftentimes you're not viewed very kindly on the other side. At the same time, I think it depends on I think there's situations where they can be, like I said. So yeah, I think there's probably something to your temporal argument. I think you should study that. It's a good idea.
Yeah, there's exactly what I said to Valentin. Valentin is one of my students at the University of São Paulo. And last class, we are just arguing about that because sometimes we see in Brazilian papers, theoretical papers, they are trying to understand the frameworks and models, and sometimes authors can put together policy brokers and the policy entrepreneur to explain change or to explain why things does not change or the stability. And Valentin asked me, Professor, how can I understand and how close and how different policy entrepreneur are from policy broker? And the first thing that came in my mind was exactly like that. I think I never thought about that, but I think the policy entrepreneur is someone that are trying to make an opportunity to change, to sell some ideas during the agenda setting process. And the policy brokers sometimes are not, or they are trying to make the incrementalist change or trying to not make the change. So maybe they have some skills, like the same skills, like resources and easy access to the media and money and whatever, like very similar skills, but they act in different moments, in my opinion. So I just suggest to Valentin to start a really important contribution about this, and I think it's amazing question.
I think that's great. One thing on top of that, in my students, I often tell them this too. Sometimes we get mixed up because these words are in our heads. They're constructs, right? And so in my head, I have the constructs, but also there's, let's see, reality, whatever that is, right? And sometimes I think we pose the constructs on reality too much, and I think that kind of gets in the way sometimes. Like we think our constructs are true. I would say just talk to the person out there doing whatever they're doing, observe the temporal stuff, like you said, and then observe their behavior. And maybe they're doing both of what they're doing, maybe they're not, but let the case drive you. And I don't know, Felipe, maybe I'm talking too much. Let's get more questions.
Yeah, Professor Leticia is asking two very important questions, and I will start with the last one. It's about applying Advocacy Coalition Framework in policy monopolies or in a non-competing domain. Like, how can we do that? Like, it is a limit of the framework. Like, if you have like a policy monopoly, if you have a non-competing domain, like you don't use the ACF, but can we? Like, what's the applications of it?
There's a good number of applications that look at ACF with, they call it a dominant coalition when there hasn't been much of an opposition. And if you take the dominant coalition to the extreme, it would be a policy monopoly. And I think when ACF and PET are not inconsistent at all. They are analyzing very different, they have different lenses, but they're actually telling a very similar story. And so if you just email me, I can give you a couple of these kind of dominant coalitions. The challenge with the dominant coalition is I think people don't quite, we're so hell-bent on understanding like, hey, here's a coalition. We're not analyzing the right questions about suppression, about who's represented, who's not, and how we bring these other voices into the game, or even analyze them from a traditional kind of theoretical point of view or from a critical perspective. That's something we need to do more of. So I think a lot of the dominant coalitional papers, they just don't get a lot of attention because they're just like a coalition. They're like, and then it's kind of, yeah. At least Bumgarner and Jones talk about the collapse of a policy monopoly. That's kind of cool.
Okay, there's another question similar to one someone already made before, and that is about the state and the state agents has on coalition. How can we say, or we cannot say, that some state agents or the state is or not a coalition? Or if we are looking at subsystem, they are part of a subsystem with different others, agents and actors and institutions.
Yeah. You know, first of all, the coalition is an interesting thing. If you ask people directly, we've done that. Are you part of a coalition? And we've kind of like, are you part of a group of people who with similar beliefs and who coordinate their behavior? We've asked almost that direct question. 80% of our surveyees said yes, right? But if you talk to government officials or scientists too, and if you ask them directly, are you part of a coalition? Oftentimes they'll say no. Oh yeah, we're neutral in none of this. And so if you ask them directly, they won't admit it. If you ask what their beliefs are, if you ask who they give their information to, who they receive information from, who perceives them as an ally, and it gets a different picture, actually. And so it's, you again, if I understand the question, how do you measure this stuff? Basically, I mean, if you do self-report, you'll get one thing. If you understand like how people perceive each other or what their coordination behavior, information behavior, you'll get a different picture. And one of the studies I've did with scientists in particular, all the scientists thought they were neutral, and I basically showed them their network patterns of who they talked to, and they're like, "Oh, I guess we're not very neutral," but they thought they were. And actually, they said that they're going to try to reach out to their opponents more because they wanted to be neutral. But I think government officials are the same way. That's one way we can actually help a subsystem, is to understand how biased our networks are.
Okay, so unfortunately, we are on time. So I just want to say thank you to the audience, to the amazing questions. And Chris, I have no words, at least not in English, to say how happy I am for this conversation, for this lecture. It was amazing, by far the best of this entire seminar. And I can see by how participative the audience. I'm so sorry about this noise. They are just making, I don't know, a new city right next to my window. So thank you so much again for all your talk and answer, and for accepting this invitation. I'm really, really glad and honored to give to my students all this opportunity. So thank you so much.
You're more than welcome, and actually great questions. Reach out to me and all the students, Felipe, please too. It's a fun community of scholars, and we don't have all the answers, but we certainly can use the questions like you're asking about these entrepreneurs and brokers and state actors and a role. I mean, it is a fun thing to try to study. So I welcome your working with you. So please reach out and come to Denver once we get through this pandemic. We do welcome visiting scholars, and we've had Enrique, gosh, I forget his last name, came. So we have had Brazilian visiting scholars here. So please come.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.